Hello there, fellow cultists. This is DM Nell, and I'm back with another episode of Shadow Talk. And this is episode number 104. And today I'm going to start my deep dive into Chapter 2, which is the chapter dedicated to playing the game. Now, this chapter is quite extensive. There is a lot to unpack here, and so I'm going to review as much of it as I can today, but more than likely this is going to take probably at least a couple of videos, if not more, just to get through the entirety of this chapter and do it justice. So, for fair warning, this is probably going to be a long video, and it probably will not finish the chapter, but we'll give it a go. So here we go. So this is the first page. And a lot of this chapter is written for beginning DMs and beginning players. So this first section is really basic stuff. Using the real world as your guide, making decisions as a GM and as a player. If you try to do something impossible, the GM will tell you the activity doesn't happen. Like, you say you're walking through a solid wall, the GM is going to tell you, well, you smack your face into the wall. Physics are still a thing, even though this is a magical world. So unless you've got a spell or something supernatural that enables you to walk through a wall, then common sense things still happen to you throughout the course of the game. So that's pretty much what this page talks about. Then we have this little section here on time. So time in this game doesn't really matter until you start into an encounter. Otherwise, the game master basically dictates the time frame. It's a good idea for the game master in any game, not just Shadow of the Demon Lord, but in any game, to have a good grasp of how much time has passed between sessions, just to ensure that your players understand the passage of time in your world. Without that, I think you're really missing out on being able to get your players really immersed into this fantasy reality that you're creating. And so a good idea. Then there's lots of tips and tricks out there on YouTube to help with timekeeping, but it's a good idea to have at least some sort of campaign diary or some kind of calendar or something, even at the beginning of each game, just stating something that this session takes place 6 months after our last session, or this session takes place 2 days after our last session, or 2 years after our last session, or whatever, just to give your players a sense of the passage of time in the world. And I think that's pretty important. So be sure to do that. But once you start getting into an encounter where the tracking of time actually matters in order to run the game, and that's when you need to know the details. And it talks a little bit about that here. When you start getting into an encounter, then you start switching your timekeeping to rounds, which are segments of time that are 10 seconds long. So the combat section of this chapter, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but a round being 10 seconds long means that during the course of a minute, you have 6 rounds. This comes up more often than you would think. There are spells and there are things that affect characters for minutes rather than rounds, so you need to know that a minute consists of 6 rounds, and a round is 10 seconds long. Now, the fact that a round is 10 seconds long doesn't really come into play too much, other than trying to keep some common sense in your head as to how much a player character can do in those 10 seconds. But that is the action economy, which we will cover in the combat section. All right, so that's the time section here. Rolling dice. So Shadow of the Demon Lord uses 2 types of dice, the D20 and the D6. The D20 basically is what you would use to determine the outcome of an activity to tell you whether or not you've succeeded or you failed. D6s are for everything else. So that would be for damage, that would be for determining boons and banes, that would be for determining any other random things on charts. If a D20 is not used on the chart, then it's a D6 that's used on the chart. So the game pretty much relies on just those two dice. Alrighty. Rolling a D20, and it kind of tells you, the basic core mechanic here. You roll a D20 to determine an activity's outcome by making an attack roll or challenge roll. Whenever you roll a D20, you follow these steps, and it tells you roll the D20 and note the number you rolled. Apply any modifiers. Add or subtract any modifiers from your character attributes or characteristics to the number that you rolled. Excuse me. The rules or the GM determines what modifier you use depending on the task that you attempt. Applying other adjustments. So add or subtract any other adjustments to the die roll, such as a bonus or penalty, or a boon or a bane. And then determine the result. So compare the final total to the target number for the roll. If the target equals or is greater than the target number, the result is a success. If the total is less than the target number, the result is a failure. The next section here goes into what a combat or attack roll is. So you make attack rolls when you attempt to influence or harm another creature or object. Example of attack rolls include swinging a weapon to strike an enemy's combatant, casting a spell to overwhelm a creature's mind, or using a mace to smash a statue. And we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of that when we talk about the combat section. The modifier, attack rolls with a melee weapon such as a battle axe or a sword normally add your strength modifier. When you make an attack with a ranged weapon such as a pistol or a crossbow, you normally add your agility modifier to the attack roll. Special kinds of attack rolls might use a different attribute modifier. Some kinds of spells require you to make attack roll, and the spell's description tells you what modifier to use when making it. We'll get more into that in the magic chapter. The target number is, for an attack roll, generally the character's or creature's defense score for weapon attacks, or an attribute score for other kinds of attacks. So this is what I was talking about in one of my earlier videos, that the attribute score actually matters in this game because it then becomes your defense for an attack that targets it. So if you have for example, if you have a snake that bites you, the initial attack is going to be against your defense, but then the snake's poison, once it enters your system, is attacking your strength score. And so your strength then becomes the target number to determine whether or not you are able to shake off the effects of the poison, whether you're making a challenge roll or whether the snake makes a secondary attack against your strength score or your strength attribute. So that's one difference between this game and D&D, in that your strength score and your constitution score and all those things really don't matter, other than to generate a modifier for you. But in this game, the actual score still matters. Success. In general, a success deals damage to the target and poses an affliction, or forces the target to move or behave in some way. For example, if you use a weapon to attack a creature and get a success, you roll the weapon's damage die. The creature takes damage equal to the total of the damage roll. Now, one thing it doesn't say there, it goes into more detail in the combat section, is that you do not add your attribute modifier to the damage roll unless you have an ability that tells you to do so. Now that again is a difference between this game and D&D. In D&D, you generally add your strength modifier to your damage, or your agility modifier to your damage. You do not do that in Shadow of the Demon Lord unless you have an ability that tells you to. Failure, the target avoids the attack. You miss with your weapon, your shot goes wide off the mark, or the spell fails to harm or take hold on the target. So it goes through an attack roll example. Then we talk about challenge rolls. So challenge rolls are this game's version of saving throws. You don't have saving throws in this game. Instead, the challenge roll is typically used to resist certain effects. So it says here, you make a challenge roll when you attempt an activity is not directly opposed by another creature and the outcome is not certain. Sometimes an action would ordinarily be simple, becomes more challenging under stress when the time is limited. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. Not only are challenge rolls taking the place of saving throws, but they are also used for ability checks, which, in D&D, it's called ability check, and that's what a challenge roll would be for Shadow of the Demon Lord. So it takes the place of both ability checks and saving throws. Examples of challenge rolls include climbing, swimming, picking locks, listening for faint sounds, reducing the damage you would take from being caught in a fireball spell, leaping back from a sprung pit trap, or clinging to your sanity in the face of something horrific. Modifier, the type of modifier, depends on the action you attempt. So, for example, if you make a strength challenge roll to smash down a door, you apply your strength modifier. If you listen to the door, you make a perception challenge roll and use your perception modifier. If you want to leap out of the path of an arcane lightning, you make an agility challenge roll and use your agility modifier. Target number. So this is, I think, one of the strengths of Shadow of the Demon. Another one of the strengths of the Shadow of the Demon Lord in its simplicity. So in Dungeons and Dragons, the target number for pretty much any type of ability check or saving throw is set by your DM, and it's a scale. It's usually starting at 10 as simple, then it goes up to 15 as difficult, then it may go up to 20 as very difficult, then it may go up to 25 as almost impossible, and then it goes up to 30 as being godlike. So the DM has to decide where on that scale any given activity might fall, and then set the target number appropriately. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, the target number is always 10. Always. So any activity that you attempt, the target number is 10. Now you might think, well, what if one activity is more difficult than another activity? That's when the DM makes the challenge roll more difficult by applying banes, or makes the challenge roll easier by applying boons. So, for example, you go up to a wooden door. It's just a standard wooden door, and your DM might say, all right, make a strength challenge roll to smash down the door. The target number is 10, and so the let's say the barbarian type character, the big burly tank guy, goes up to the door and rolls a 19, and adds their strength modifier, so that makes it 21, and smashes the door in easily. Then they go and find another door. This door is reinforced wood with iron bands around it, so it's more difficult. So the big burly guy muscles up to that door, but this time the DM says, yes, you can make this challenge roll, but you have 2 banes on the roll because it is a reinforced door. So now the tank makes a strength challenge roll. So they roll their d20, add their strength modifier, but they also have to roll 2d6 and take the higher of those rolls and subtract it from their challenge roll. So let's say the big burly tank muscles up to the door and rolls an 11 and adds his strength modifier plus 2, which makes it the roll a 13. However, he rolls 2d6, and he rolls a 3, and he rolls a 5. He has to subtract the 5 because it's the higher of the 2 dice. He has to subtract that 5 from his roll of 13, which now makes the number 8, thus resulting in a failure on that challenge roll because it's less than 10. The final number is less than 10. So that's how the DM adjudicates difficulty in the game, by applying banes when something is more difficult, or applying boons if something is easier to accomplish. And of course, success is the activity happens as desired. Failure, the activity just doesn't happen. or you don't get the desired outcome. If you attempt the same activity again under identical circumstances, it automatically results in a failure. So this is something you might want to highlight because this is important, especially when you have something like a big burly guy trying to smash down a door, or a thief or a rogue trying to pick a lock, and they fail and they say, well, I want to try again. All right, this right here tells you if you attempt the same activity again under identical circumstances, it automatically results in failure. So as a DM, you need to adjudicate this fairly. So let's say that let's say you have a rogue and they are trying to pick a lock that is pretty challenging. So let's say at first they are using a toothpick and a hairpin to try to pick a lock, not using thieves' tools. And so you assign the difficulty, and let's say that they fail the roll, and they say they're going to try again. Automatically fails. But if they then say, well, okay, I'm going to pull out my thieves' tools and try again with using my thieves' tools. All right, well, the activity is the same, but the circumstances change because the thief is going from using a toothpick and a hairpin to tools that actually help accomplish the activity that's being attempted. Now, if using the thieves' tools, the thief fails again and tries again, it's still going to automatically fail because the circumstances, again, don't change if they continue to try to pick the same lock with thieves' tools. So this is something that the DM has to adjudicate. And I have to be honest, I have not done this very well in my games. So this is something, again, you might want to highlight this in your rule book because it's pretty important to push this during your games, because otherwise challenges become not a challenge if your players can just roll over and over again, because given enough rolls, they're going to succeed. All you're doing is wasting game time. So highlight that sentence right there because it's super important. All right. So, and there's a couple of examples there because in case mine are too shitty to apply. So let's see what we have next here. A couple of challenge roll examples. Bonus and penalties. In many situations in play can confer a bonus or penalty on a d20 roll representing an advantage or a disadvantage. A bonus is always a positive number, which you add to a roll, and a penalty is always a negative number, which you subtract. A single die roll might have bonuses and penalties from different sources. These are cumulative, so you need to total them up and add them to the total of your roll. All right, so just as a side note, you don't get a whole lot of bonus and penalties like a +1 or +2, except from your ability scores. Every once in a while, you might get something from a spell, or you might get something from some other thing that gives you a +1 or a -1 or whatever, but most bonuses and penalties come in the form of boons and banes. So keep that in mind. And here we go with boons and banes. So I've mentioned boons and banes quite a few times now, and I use the example over here, but this explains in detail what a boon and a bane is. So circumstances can make d20 rolls easier and harder. Positive circumstances grant one or more boons, while negative circumstances impose one or more banes. Boons improve your d20 die rolls. One or more boons might apply to a given roll. For each boon, you roll a d6 and then add the highest number rolled on all the boon dice to the d20 roll. For example, if you make a d20 roll with 3 boons, you would roll 3d6. So let's say you get a 1, a 4, and a 6 on those 3 dice. The 6 is the highest number, so that is the one that you add to your die roll. You don't add the 1, 4, and 6 together. You only take the highest of those 3 die rolls. So the more boons you have basically just means the more chances you get to roll a higher number. But you always only take the highest number of whatever boon and bane dice that you are rolling. You can roll 20d6, and the most that you will get out of that is a plus or minus 6 to your roll. All right, Banes hinder your d20 die rolls. One or more Banes might apply to a given roll. For each Bane, you roll a d6 and then subtract the highest number on all the Bane dice from your d20 roll. For example, if you make a d20 roll with 4 Banes, you would roll 4d6. Let's say you get 1, 3, 5, and 5 on those dice. Since 5 is the highest number, you would subtract 5 from your d20 roll. All right, so again, you could roll 20d6, but the highest number that you could possibly get would be a 6, which you would either, if it's a boon, you would add the 6 to your roll, or if it's a bane, you would subtract the 6 from your roll. Boons and banes also cancel each other out 1 for 1. So, if 2 boons and 1 bane apply to a particular d20 roll, you may make the roll with 1 boon. 1 bane cancels 1 boon. Similarly, if 2 boons apply and 4 banes apply, then you would end up making the roll with 2 banes. 2 boons cancel 2 banes. So this is where it can get a little bit confusing in higher levels, because you have to keep track of how many boons and banes you're dealing with. And boons and banes can come from a lot of different sources. So you may have a fellow character that's granting you boons on your attack roll, but you may have banes because of a circumstance. And then you might get another boon from another source. So you have to remember, well, okay, so my buddy Mark over here has given me 2 boons because of a path ability that he has. And then my buddy Brian over here may be giving me a boon because of his ability, but because of the circumstance, I have 3 banes. So those 3 boons, those 3 banes cancel each other out. So then you're left with just making your roll as normal. All right, so boons and banes are really just the this game's version of advantage and disadvantage. And as a DM and as a person that runs the game, I find it much more balanced with boons and banes. Advantage and disadvantage, although it's easier to play advantage and disadvantage, it is much more swingy. I hate advantage and disadvantage when I'm running Dungeons and Dragons, because it is, as a DM, you're saddled with disadvantages a lot by your player characters, and if you're making every roll for your NPCs with disadvantage, then you're basically neuters your NPCs. But you can apply all kinds of banes to an NPC in this game, but the most you're ever going to subtract is a d6. So it is definitely much less swingy than it is in D&D. All right, so that's it for boons and banes. Now we get into attributes. Attributes we talked about a lot in the last chapter, so I'm just kind of going to go over this at a higher level than it's written in the book. But again, your attributes are strength, agility, intellect, and will. Each attribute has 2 numbers, a score and a modifier. Together, these numbers reflect a creature's natural talent and formal training when attempting to do things in the game. So an attribute's score ranges from 1 to 20. Player characters usually have starting scores from 8 to 13. So you can't get a score higher than 20, and you can't get a score lower than 1. Alrighty, modifier. An attribute's modifier equals its score minus 10. You apply this number to d20 rolls when you use the attribute. So using your attributes, this little chart is handy because it tells you that your strength score applies to your health characteristic, your agility score applies to your defense, your intellect applies to your perception, and your will applies to your insanity. So if you're trying to decide, how to manage your attributes, you want to think about how it affects your other characteristics. And that goes into detail on each attribute. And for strength, it talks about your strength score being the target number that would attack for any attack that would directly harm your body. So anything that affects your um, what would be your constitution in D&D would affect your strength score in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Your health measures your ability to withstand damage. Your starting health equals your strength score and might be adjusted by your ancestry. If your strength score increases, your health increases by the same amount. So I think I mentioned that in the creating a character chapter. Attack rolls. Make your strength attack roll when you attack with a melee weapon or use brute force to shove, grab, or knock down another creature. Challenge rolls. You make a strength challenge roll when you're attempting an athletic activity such as climbing, running, long distances, or swimming. You also make strength challenge rolls to resist the effect of poison, disease, and similar harmful substances or situations. Lifting weights. Your strength score determines how much weight you can normally lift, as shown on the lifting weights by strength table. The normal column lists how much weight you can reliably lift over your head without having to make a strength challenge roll. The success column lists the maximum you can lift by getting a success on a strength challenge roll. So that would be this table here. So this is the normal. You can make a roll, or you can lift this much without having to make a roll, and then by making a strength challenge roll, you can lift this much. So just to give this some perspective, if you have a strength of 10, you can lift 100 pounds without making a roll, but you can lift up to 200 pounds by making a strength challenge roll. If you have a strength of 15, you can lift 1,000 pounds. So, strength of 15 in D&D is not that impressive. Shadow of the Demon Lord strength of 15 is pretty impressive. Strength of 20 is superhuman. So this really puts your strength attribute into perspective. Okay, size. Large creatures can lift greater weights, while smaller creatures can't lift as much. Multiply a creature's lifting weight for its strength by its size. See characteristics. To determine how much it can lift. For example, a size 2 creature with a strength of 10 can reliably lift 200 pounds. So this, for a size 2 creature, multiplied by 2, that gives you 200 pounds. Or 400 pounds with a success on a strength challenge roll. So this would be 200 times 2, which would be 400 pounds. Dragging and shoving. A creature can drag up to about 5 times the weight it can normally lift. Using an action, see combat, a creature can drag or shove such an object up to 2 yards across a reasonably flat surface, 1 yard up a sloped surface, or 3 yards down a sloped surface. So, again, this would be probably something that you might want to highlight. Doesn't come into play very often, but this is a great reference for when it does come into play. All right, so for if you're a normal size 1 creature and you're trying to drag something across a flat plane, and you have a strength of 10, then you can drag up to 500 pounds without having to make a strength challenge roll. Or with a strength challenge roll, you could drag up to 1,000 pounds, and you can do so up to 2 yards across a reasonably flat surface using an action. We'll get into the action economy a little bit later on. Or 1 yard up a sloped surface, or 3 yards down a sloped surface. All right. Excuse me. All right, agility. So agility describes quickness, poise, and reflexes. Your agility score is a target number for any kind of attack that needs only to touch you or that would trap you. Defense. Your defense score is the target number for enemies attacking using weapons. It attacks your agility score when you are not wearing armor or using a shield. So your agility score is your default defense number, but if you're wearing armor or using a shield, then those things supplement your defense, which is why you have a separate defense score But typically, if something is attacking you and you're unarmored, your agility score becomes your target number. Attack rolls. You make agility attack rolls when you attack with ranged weapons or with melee weapons that have the finesse property. Challenge roll, and we'll get into that when we get into the equipment section. Finesse property is basically the same in this game as it is in D&D. Challenge rolls. You make agility challenge rolls when you attempt physical activities that involve quickness and dexterity, such as jumping, leaping, escaping bonds, or squeezing through a tight space. You also make agility challenge rolls to reduce damage from being caught in an explosion or to avoid sudden danger, such as a sprung attack. That's pretty intuitive. Then we go into intellect. Intellect describes cunning, wit, memory, and education. Your intellect score is the target number for any kind of attack that would deceive or confuse your mind, thoughts, and senses. Perception is keyed off of intellect, so you use your perception, you would use it to notice and interact with your surroundings. Your base perception score normally equals your intellect score, but your ancestry can adjust this score. You make intellect attack rolls when you cast certain spells or when you try to deceive another character or creature. Challenge rolls. You make intellect challenge rolls when you try to recall obscure information, use logic to solve a problem, or attempt any other activity that requires knowledge or education. So if you're trying to recall, what the weaknesses of a muttering maw might be, then your GM might ask you to make a intellect challenge roll, applying any type of professions that you may have. So if you have an academic profession that exposed you to the weaknesses of muttering maws, then you would be given a boon to that challenge roll. We'll get more into that later. All right, so that is intellect. Then we go into will. Will describes courage, discipline, and sense of self. Your will score is the target number for any attack that would force you to act against your will, such as being charmed, compelled, or frightened. Insanity. Terrifying or unnatural experiences can drive characters insane. Your will score is the maximum amount of insanity that you can gain before you go mad. We'll get more into that when we talk about insanity. Attack rolls. You make will challenge rolls when you cast certain spells or try to persuade or intimidate another creature. And then challenge rolls. You make will challenge rolls when you use determination to overcome a challenge. You also make will challenge rolls to resist effects that would determine or restrict actions or to avoid gaining insanity. All right, so then you have your other characteristics. So I already talked about health. That's basically your maximum hit points. Your health never goes down unless a specific attack tells you to reduce your health score. Your health does increase as you level up. Injured. So injured basically is a way of saying that a creature has taken enough damage to equal or exceed half of their health score. Generally doesn't come into play, but every once in a while there might be something that triggers when something is injured. So just noting the term injured, and when your dungeon master indicates that a creature is injured, if you have an ability that triggers off of that, then it would come into play at that point. Or if the dungeon master is running a monster that has an ability that's triggered off of them being injured or a character being injured, then it would apply at that point. Healing rate is how much damage you can recover when you take a rest or when you are given healing of some sort. So you will, if you're given healing, it will generally tell you how much you gain. Sometimes it's half your healing rate. Sometimes it's your entire healing rate. Sometimes it's more than your healing rate. Sometimes it's double or triple or whatever. But your healing rate is the base amount that you can heal when you have the opportunity to heal. Creature's healing rate equals 1/4 its health, which is a minimum of 1. And if the creature's health score increases, its healing rate also increases. Defense. Defense represents the protection a creature or object has against attacks made with weapons. Objects typically have a defense of 5, so that might be something that you highlight. Maximum defense. A creature's defense cannot exceed 25, even if weapons, armor, or other effects would increase it beyond that number. So this is also a good thing to highlight. Doesn't come up too often, but once you start getting into the master tier, then things get gonzo, and this could apply at that point. Perception. Perception works just like an attribute. It has both a score and a modifier. A high perception indicates sharp senses, while a low number indicates that the creature has poor vision or hearing, or its senses are otherwise limited. Your base perception score equals your intellect score. Your ancestry can increase this number. Other creatures might also have increased perception scores based on their nature. A creature's perception score cannot exceed 25, just like with their attributes. Challenge rolls. You make perception challenge rolls when you try to listen for sounds, notice a detail in your environment, or recognize an illusion for what it is. And here we go with insanity. All right, now these are the base rules for insanity. There is a supplement that expands on these rules. But these are the core rules. So here we go. Insanity. Characters risk madness when they encounter the strange, the unsettling, or the awful. Being affected by dark magic, encountering horrifying demons released from the void, and witnessing sudden acts, brutal violence can stress or even shatter the mind. Insanity measures this stress. Insanity total. Most characters begin with insanity of 0. You cannot gain more insanity than your will score. Gaining sanity. Sorry, it sneaks up on me, otherwise I would cover my mic. Gaining insanity. Certain situations cause you to gain insanity as directed by the rules or at your GM's discretion. Whenever you gain insanity, you become frightened for a number of rounds equal to your new insanity score. So this is worthy of highlighting. If you are already frightened, you must get a success on a will challenge roll or become stunned for 1 round as well. So again, this whole section here is worthy of highlighting. And of course, I can't figure out how to highlight. But anyway, just highlight that whole section there. When your insanity total reaches your will score, then you go mad. So what happens when you go mad? When you go mad, remove the fright and affliction gained from insanity and roll a d20, then consult the madness table to determine what happens to you. Most forms of madness are temporary. Once the madness ends, then reduce your insanity score by 1d6 plus your will modifier. This would be a good thing to highlight. All right, so what can happen when you roll on this table? Some crazy shit can happen on this table. Crazy shit. see what I did there? Yeah. All right, so you're rolling a d20, and the first thing that could happen if you roll a 1, your heart stops and you die. Yes, you can die from going mad. But that's if you're unlucky enough to roll a 1. The rest of this basically just is some things that can affect your character but doesn't take you out of the game. So you have catatonia, you fall prone and become defenseless. At the end of each hour, roll a d6. A roll of 4 or higher ends the madness. Self-mutilation. You must use an action on your next turn to tear your eyes from your sockets unless you are prevented from doing so. You become blinded until your ruined eyes can be magically repaired. The madness ends at the end of the next minute. Yeah, that's pretty brutal. Stricken. You become stunned at the end of each minute. Roll a d6. Roll a 5 or higher ends the madness. That's not so bad. Takes you out of the game, but at least you're not ripping your eyes out. Sickened. You become violently sick, vomiting and defecating uncontrollably until the madness ends. While sickened, you are dazed. At the end of each round, roll a d6. So roll a 5 or higher ends the madness. Then you have, I'm not going to read through each of these, but, the higher you get, the better it is for you. So it ends with revelation. Reduce your insanity score by 1d6. You permanently make all will challenge rolls to resist, gaining insanity with 1 boon. So that's the best option on this table to roll. All right, so what happens after you gain insanity, how does this affect your character, and how can you get rid of insanity? Because nobody wants to necessarily have to deal with the effects of insanity forever. So that's when quirks come into play. So you can remove insanity by gaining quirks. A quirk is a compulsive behavior, a phobia, or another condition that permanently affects your character. You can gain a quirk at any time, though once you do so, you cannot gain another quirk until after you complete a rest. The GM chooses a quirk that's appropriate for the most recent source of your insanity, and then you reduce your insanity total by 1d6. So that's one way you can reduce your own insanity score without using magic. There are certain spells that allow insanity to be mitigated as well, but just by applying quirks, this will help you manage your insanity score down. Now, this is kind of tough to adjudicate as a DM because now you have to remember quirks. And if each player character in your game has gained insanity and chooses to use quirks to offset the insanity score, now you have to remember each character's quirk and make sure that they are role-playing those correctly when a situation applies. I'm not a fan of this because of all the bookkeeping that the DM already has to do, and they have to remember this as well. Now, good players will remember their quirks and will incorporate those in the game and make the game hilarious. But other player characters that aren't good at using quirks but just want to game the system will say that they're adding quirks, but they never role play them. All they're doing is reducing their insanity score without having to work for it. And so I would really, as a DM, think about how you adjudicate quirks, or if you even want to include them in your game at all. To be honest with you, I haven't even included this in my game. I have not mentioned this to my player characters, nor am I going to, if they do question it, I'm going to say it's not something that I use in the game. Now, could I apply it in a special circumstance? Sure. I'm the dungeon master. I can do whatever the fuck I want. But having this be a core rule, I find to be a little bit too much bookkeeping potentially. So I would strongly recommend before you start your game to determine whether you're going to use a quirk. Now, if you do use a quirk, I recommend getting the supplement that deals with the expanded insanity, and there's another supplement that deals with quirks, specifically with a bunch of quirks already outlined for you, so that you don't have to sit there and try to think of a different quirk for all the different characters that are trying to game your system. So, that's quirks. Now let's talk about corruption. So corruption is a great add to this game because it is a mechanic that prevents player characters from playing douchebag characters. Or players from playing douchebag characters, I should say. Corruption is an evil stain on the mortal soul that can be removed only by devils haunting hell's depths. So these warp fairies feed on the darkness that burdens immortal essences. Most people believe evil actions have spiritual consequences, though many don't care. Player characters have corruption scores to reflect the evil they commit. The more corrupt a character becomes, the greater the taint of evil on his or her soul until it is consigned to hell. Most characters start with a corruption of 0. I believe the orc character starts with 1 corruption. Your corruption score might increase during the game, usually as a result of performing an evil act of great evil as determined by the DM or the rules. Examples include murder, harming an innocent by spreading a disease, poisoning a well, or being reckless with magic, stealing for personal gain, learning spells from dark traditions such as forbidden or necromancy, using certain relics. As your corruption score increases, you suffer increasingly unpleasant effects. In addition, whenever you gain corruption, roll a d20. If the number rolled is less than your new corruption score, roll the d20 again, and consult the Mark of Darkness table. If you would gain a Mark of Darkness you already have, you instead gain 2d6 insanity. This is worthy of highlighting. Okay, so the DM, well, let's just back up here. Let's say you're being a douchebag and you straight up murderize somebody in a village just because they're giving you lip, right? So that gains you corruption. Your DM says, all right, you gain a point of corruption. So 1 point of corruption, you can't roll less than that. So when you get your first point of corruption, it's basically a freebie. It's just starting you on the road down the path of corruption. Then you're in the next town and you decide that you're low on funds, so you're going to break into a general store and steal some items for your next quest. The DM gives you another point of corruption. So now you have 2 points of corruption. When you gain that second point of corruption, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1, it has to be under your current corruption score. So your current corruption score at that point would be 2. So you would have to roll a d20, and if you roll a 1 on that roll, then you gain a Mark of Darkness. And you have to roll on the Mark of Darkness table. So the Mark of Darkness table is this table over here. You also have automatic corruption effects just by having a certain corruption score, which is the table right above it. So 0 to 3, you have no effect. So at this point, you only have 2 corruption. All you have to do is roll on the Mark of Darkness table, and whatever you roll determines what your Mark of Darkness is. It can be anything from you never cast a reflection in mirrors, to you weep blood, to once a week a child within a mile of you sickens and dies. Yeah. Once you accumulate enough corruption to start manifesting itself, then this table up here comes into play. So if you have anywhere between 4 and 6 points of corruption, you make attack rolls to interact with other creatures in a social setting with 1 bane. As well, animals become hostile around you and children might cry. If your corruption score is between 7 and 8, you take a -1 penalty on d6 rolls to decide your fate while you are incapacitated. In addition, you exhibit a physical sign of corruption, such as a sore that never heals, weird marks on the skin, loss of fingernails, or some other cosmetic change. If you have 9 or more points of corruption, you die if you become incapacitated, and you cannot be restored to life. Your soul is trapped in hell. So at this point, with 9 or more corruption, as soon as you become incapacitated, hell notices, and they open up a temporary portal, drag you down to hell, and you are gone. No fate rolls for you, my friend. We'll talk about fate rolls later. All right, so that is corruption. Now, how do you get rid of corruption? The simple answer is you don't. You can atone. This little paragraph here talks about atonement, but atonement takes years. So unless your DM is super nice and their campaign goes over the course of many months and many years, and you are serious about dedicating the time and the effort to atone, then your GM might allow you to drop, maybe 1d3 points of corruption, or maybe 1 point of corruption, or maybe a d6 point of corruption, just depending on how much you are making amends. But really, I would say, you know what? Unless you are really good at talking me into how you're atoning for this, or you're making a significant sacrifice, atonement's not going to come into play. At least not in my campaign. You can do it in your campaign however you want. All right. Other characteristics. It talks about power. We've already mentioned power, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on. We've already talked about size. We're going to move on from that. Space. The space a creature occupies is important in combat and in special situations, such as squeezing through a narrow opening. A creature is considered to occupy a horizontal square space roughly equal to its size on each side. Thus, a size 1 creature occupies a 1-yard square, while a size 3 creature occupies a 3-yard square. It isn't literally filling the whole space, but it is moving around in and otherwise controlling that area. A creature's size See, a creature's size does not account for its height, which varies from creature to creature. So you could have a size 3 creature that is 3 by 3, but is not necessarily 3 yards high, or it could be larger than 3 yards high or taller than 3 yards high. Things like worms. If you have great worms, for example, dire worm could be really super long. When it stands up, it's really high. It could be a size 3 creature, but it could be like 5 yards long. Anyway, that's a bad example, but you get the drift. Okay, reach. Larger creatures can reach farther than smaller ones, letting them attack or interact with things at a distance. A creature's reach equals its size rounded up to the nearest whole number. For example, a size 1 or smaller creature can make an attack with a battle axe against a target or open a closed door within 1 yard of it, while a size 2 creature can do so within 2 yards of it. All right, so I would highlight that as well. Speed. Speed is a number that tells you how quickly a creature moves. On its turn in combat, a creature can move up to its speed in yards. Outside of combat, creatures can travel longer distances over time. So there's a whole section talking about travel time deeper in the core rulebook. Distance traveled. Sometimes you might need to know how far a creature can move during a period of time. The movement by pace table tells you how far a creature travels depending on its pace. Cautious, walk, jog, or run. The table assumes a speed of 10, which is typical for humans and similar creatures. So movement by pace is up here. So it allows you to determine how far creatures can walk with these time increments. So on a given day, a creature that is being cautious can walk 8 miles. A creature that is just walking can walk 24 miles. And a creature that is jogging can jog 32 miles. Faster and slower creatures for every point of speed beyond 10 for every point of speed beyond 10, increase the distance moved by 10%. For example, an orc's base speed is 12, so an orc character can walk 108 yards in 1 minute. So that would be something to highlight. For every point of speed below 10, decrease the distance moved by 10%. So again, we're going to highlight that. All right. So it goes into what cautious walking, cautious movement, walking, jogging, and running is. Cautious, at this pace you move quietly and watchfully. While moving at this pace, you make all perception rolls with 1 boon. Running, you sprint, moving as fast as you can. Dwarves are natural-born sprinters, after all. Each hour of running counts as 4 hours of walking. You make all perception rolls with 2 banes while moving at this pace. It's typically not possible to run for 8 consecutive hours without taking periods of rest. Unless, of course, you are a dwarf. I'm joking, of course. That's a reference to Lord of the Rings, for those of you who are not picking up on that. All right, so that is movement. Movement effects. Sidebar. When an effect such as from a trait or a spell talks about moving, the default movement pace, unless otherwise indicated, is in the effects text, is walking on the ground. And then you have forced march. If you travel more than the equivalent of 8 hours without taking a break for 1 hour or longer, you risk exhaustion. At the end of each additional hour of travel, regardless of the pace, make a strength challenge roll. This roll is made with 1 bane if you are jogging, or with 2 banes if you are running. On a failure, you take 1d6 damage and become fatigued until you complete a rest. This is worthy of highlighting. Doesn't come into play too much unless you're doing a travel from here to there. It matters, and you're trying to beat the clock or something like that. Then you might have a forced march that this could come into play. Difficult terrain. Difficult terrain basically means that it takes twice as much movement to move over any area that's considered to have difficult terrain. So it's just like D&D. I'm not going to spend time going over that in detail. Narrow spaces means you have to squeeze through the spaces, which takes twice as much movement to squeeze through smaller spaces. And so let's see, a creature can move half normal rate through an opening as narrow as half the width of its space, but no smaller. For example, a size 1 creature can squeeze through a tunnel that's half a yard wide, but not through a foot wide opening. If the narrow space includes difficult terrain, the effects are cumulative as described under the difficult terrain. GM might roll the space is too low to move through, regardless of its width, depending on the creature's height. So that's something that the DM kind of has to adjudicate, but those are the typical rules. Being moved. A creature can be moved, willingly or not, by other creatures' actions or effects. The source of movement specifies the distance and direction moved, and the creature immediately moves as directed. Difficult terrain still affects this movement. If a creature pushes you 2 yards across rubble, you would only move 1 yard. Moving into peril. No, the peril is too perilous. If being moved would put a creature into peril, such as over the edge of a cliff or into a wall of flames, the creature makes an agility challenge roll. On the falls prone just before it enters the peril at the cliff's edge, for example, and then stops moving from the effect that moved it. So this is worthy of highlighting. Because, again, that's something that comes into play every once in a great while. Movement through creatures. A creature cannot move through a space occupied by another creature, friend or foe. You see, I've been a little bit generous with this. I've been allowing movement through friendly spaces, but not through my foe spaces. But you cannot move through a space occupied by another creature, friend or foe, without squeezing, unless the other creature is very small or very large. Any creature can move freely through the space of a size 1/4 creature or of a creature whose size is 2 or more larger than its own. For example, a size 1 creature could move through the space occupied by a size 1/4 creature or by a size 3 or larger creature. Creatures can also move freely through the spaces of prone creatures. So this whole paragraph is worthy of highlighting. Special forms of movement. Usually, a creature moves by walking or running or slithering across the ground. Creatures can also use some or all of the following special forms of movement, which is described under Move in the Combat section of this chapter. Common sense should always prevail when deciding what forms of movement a creature might attempt. Elephants and horses don't climb well at all. Oozes tend to be poor jumpers. The GM can rule that certain kinds of movement aren't possible for creatures based on their nature and anatomy. Falling. So I love this table. Falling, when you fall a distance of 5 or more yards, you take damage from landing. Use the falling damage table to determine the amount of damage based on the surface on which you land. So if I got an itch in my ear. If you are falling 4 or fewer yards, and you don't take any damage. If you fall 5 to 9 yards and you land on a solid surface, you take 2d6 damage or 1d6 if it's liquid, and so on and so forth. So that's a nice table. Land prone. If you take damage from landing after a fall, you fall prone. If you don't take damage, then you superhero land. Falling onto other creatures and objects. If you land on another creature or object other than the ground, both you and the creature or object on which you fell take half the damage from landing or the fall. So this is a great thing to highlight. Doesn't come into play very often, but good to know. And then we get to the damage section. All right, so damage. And let me see here. How long have I been talking? I have no idea. All right. Let's see here. Damage. Do I want to get into this? Yeah. Let's get down to afflictions and we'll call it a day. All right. So damage All kinds of harmful effects can deal damage to creatures and objects. A weapon slices into unprotected flesh, into fearsome trap springs, or a nasty spell sprays acid. Okay, so let me summarize this because I don't want to read all of this stuff, and you don't want me to read all this stuff. So you track damage separately, as I mentioned when we were covering character creation. You start with 0 damage, and as you accumulate damage, then you add it up and you compare your damage to your health score. Your health is your maximum hit points using D&D terms. So once your damage equals your health score, and it cannot exceed your health score. So if you take enough damage to exceed your health score, it just stops when you reach your health score. So that's when you become potentially become incapacitated and start making fate rolls to determine if you die or not. But you also need to determine the damage source, because every once in a while you will gain resistance or vulnerabilities to certain damage sources, and so that can make the difference as to how much damage that you take. So if you are resistant to fire and you take damage from a fireball spell, then you would take half damage from that. However, if you're vulnerable to cold and you get hit by a blast of cold, then you would take double damage from that particular source of damage. So you add the amount of damage up, you track it in the space on your character sheet, and then once it reaches half your health score, as I mentioned earlier, that means that you are injured, and that can trigger things. So you would want to, or your GM might ask you, are you injured? If they have something up their sleeve from one of the monsters that they are running, that could be triggered if you are injured. Okay, so that is taking damage. Now, rolling damage, you roll damage once per attack. If a single attack or effect deals damage to more than one target, you apply the amount of damage to each one. So you don't roll damage separately for each thing. If your attack affected several creatures, you just roll once and you apply that damage to all of the creatures. You don't divide it out amongst the creatures. You add that amount of damage to all of those creatures. Extra damage. In many situations, might cause an attack to deal extra damage. Any extra damage applies only if the attack normally deals damage. Extra damage granted by different sources are cumulative. Effects of damage. A creature or object affects no ill effects from taking damage until its damage total equals health. If its health. If a creature's damage total equals its health, a creature becomes incapacitated. If an object's damage equals its health, it's destroyed. The damage total can never exceed the health of the creature, as I mentioned. Any excess damage is ignored. All right, so here's the instant death roll. Every game seems to have an instant death roll. This is no different. So a creature dies if it takes an amount of damage equal to its health from a single source, such as an attack or landing after a fall. Incapacitated. A creature becomes incapacitated when its damage total equals its health score. Upon becoming incapacitated, the creature falls prone. A creature remains incapacitated until its damage no longer equals its health. If the creature takes any damage while incapacitated, it dies. All right, so that last sentence bears highlighting. A creature other than a player character that becomes incapacitated either die or fall unconscious for a D3 hours, as the DM decides. Player characters, however, become disabled and make fate rolls to determine what happens to them. So a creature becomes incapacitated when its damage equals its health score. It falls prone, and then it becomes disabled and has to make fate rolls. These are a lot of things that happen sequentially here. So the first thing that happens is you fall unconscious, or you're incapacitated, you fall prone, and you become disabled. So what does disabled mean? Disabled means that your character is defenseless. So defenseless is an attribute, it is an affliction, and we will get into affliction in next video. Fate roll. At the end of each round, you are disabled. You have to roll a d6. On a 1, you start dying. On a 6, you heal 1 damage, and you become impaired. So by healing 1 damage, that means you're no longer incapacitated and you can stand up from being prone and you are active again. However, you gain the impaired affliction, which we will talk about next time. A roll of any other number has no effect. So if you roll anywhere between 2 and 5, then nothing happens. After 3 consecutive rounds and you are still disabled, you become unconscious, kind of stabilize, and you're unconscious for 1 to 3 hours. You stop making the fate rolls. At the end of this time, you heal 1 damage and you become impaired for 1 minute. So let's say you become incapacitated, you fall prone, you're disabled, and you start making your fate rolls. So your first fate roll, you roll a d6 and you roll a 1. That means you start dying. Dying characters are unconscious. So unconscious is another affliction, which we will talk about next time. Then you make a fate roll. At the end of each round, you are dying. Roll a d6. On a roll, you die. That's it. You're dead. On a 6, you become disabled. Any roll other than that number has no effect. So if you roll a 6, then you become disabled. So there's like a hierarchy of death and dying, starting with the disabled and going to dying and then dead. This can be a little bit confusing, so you might read through this a few times, or you might apply a simpler, an easier solution for your game, especially if you want a more brutal game. And I would recommend looking at Forbidden Rules, and there's a section on easier or simplified dying and death. But these are optional. So the core rule is this death track, starting with incapacitated, going to disabled, then dying, and then dead. So that is, again, something you need to read through a few times before you start running your game, because it will come into play. All right, so dealing damage. So healing damage. So characters heal damage or creatures heal damage by resting or from equipment, certain talents, and healing magic. When a creature heals damage, it reduces its damage total by the amount healed. So again, the number that is being moved up or down is the damage number, not the health number. So when you heal damage, then you just subtract the amount of healing from your damage score, thus reducing your damage that you have. The goal is to get down to 0 damage. That means you're unhurt. Once you have damage, that means you got cuts and bruises and wounds and your ego is hurt and you got headache and all those things. So how do you heal damage? Well, one way is by resting. You can benefit from a rest once per 24 hours. A rest is a period of inactivity that lasts about 8 hours. During this time, you can sleep, meditate, read, eat and drink, or perform other non-strenuous tasks. When you complete the rest, you heal damage equal to your healing rate. You can extend the period of rest to a full 24 hours. If you do so, at the end of this time, you heal damage equal twice your healing rate instead of just your healing rate. If something interrupts the rest for more than 1 minute, however, the time spent resting is wasted and you must start the rest over from the beginning to gain any benefit from it. So you could potentially be attacked in the middle of your rest, but if the attack lasts less than a minute, and again, a minute is 6 rounds. If the attack only lasts 3 rounds, and that does not interrupt your rest. If it lasts for 8 rounds, it interrupts your rest and you have to start all over again. So that is the rule for healing from resting. You can rest once per 24 hours. You have to rest for at least 8 hours. And if that rest is interrupted by more than 1 minute, then you have to start all over again. Death. When a creature dies, it becomes an object. Dead creatures cannot be restored to life by healing their damage. When mortal creatures die, their souls wriggle free from their corpses hang around for a bit, and then move off to whatever awaits them in the afterlife. Most sink into the underworld, where they remain until their memories and identities fade. Souls tainted by corruption descend into hell instead. Immortal creatures do not have souls. Their essence is bound to their physical body, so that when they die, their essence becomes dormant inside them, rotting away with their flesh. If the body is returned to life, the essence is also restored. So what is an immortal creature? Well, there are certain ancestries that are considered to be immortal. The elemental creatures are immortal. Elves and fairy creatures, most fairy creatures, are immortal. Some of them aren't, like goblins are not immortal. And so, basically, if they die, then it's game over for them. But mortal creatures have a soul, and so they can be reborn later. It really doesn't matter game-wise, because dead is dead, and you're rolling up a new character. But, if you're interested in what happens to your character's soul after they die, well, they either go to the underworld and eventually become reborn as a new character, or their souls are tainted by corruption and they suffer in hell. All right, returning from death. Powerful magic can restore death. When a dead creature returns to life in its original body, it has all the attributes and characteristic scores except the damage as noted in the effect that restores the creatures to life if it had at the time of death. It also gains 1d6 insanity. So this is something worthy of highlighting. If this would drive the creature mad, it instead lingers in a permanent vegetative state trapped in its body until it dies. While in the state, the creature is unconscious. Starting a new character. If you die and you're not restored to life, your next character begins with a healing potion as compensation for the cruel twist of fate that abbreviated your last character's career. So this is worthy of highlighting as well. All right. This little sidebar down here talks about reincarnation. I'm not going to read it, but basically it just says what I just mentioned a minute ago. If you have a soul, you eventually get reincarnated, but your soul goes to the underworld for years or even decades to forget its former life, and then it's reborn. Corrupted souls go to hell first, get purged of their corruption, and then could potentially go to the underworld to forget their past lives as well if they haven't already. So it could take longer for souls that go to hell to eventually make it back. All right. So that is where we will stop. The next section is afflictions, and I think that we will tackle that one in the next video. All right, so hopefully this is being helpful for those of you new to the game. And again, I'm kind of assuming that most of you new to the game have played other games such as D&D or Pathfinder, and so a lot of this stuff is similar, if not exactly the same as some of those other games, and click into place pretty quickly. Some of this stuff, especially the stuff that I'm highlighting, is different enough that you want to mark it out in your core rulebook. So once again, we will continue. We being me, will continue this series by doing continuing my deep dive into the core rulebook, and we'll do this again next time. So thanks for watching, and hail to the Demon Lord. How do I stop this damn thing?